This is Keep Talking. I'm Anuradha Sengupta, and today we are going to try and understand why American President Donald Trump is running amok again. We saw all of 2025 how he disrupted global trade by unleashing unilateral tariffs that left many nations reeling. We are barely into 2026, and he has already attacked Venezuela and captured its president, Nicolas Maduro, and the first lady. He's eyeing Greenland next. He wants to annex it. He's offered help to the protesters in Iran, and he's also soliciting countries to join the board of peace. To understand the deeper underlying reasons for everything that is happening, and is this something that goes beyond just Donald Trump's unique personality and what he's unleashing on the world stage? I'm talking to someone who has a very interesting take, and you don't often hear him in the mainstream Indian media. Please welcome Vijay Prashad. He's the director of Tricontinental Institute of Social Research. He's a journalist, editor, author, and also one of the most articulate and vocal voices for the global south as well as the global left. Vijay, thank you very much for making time.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
So, this is an incredible time. We've begun 2026, and we're already looking at actual military action that the US has undertaken. We've been reading all the statements that are coming out of from the top leadership. But in the UN, they said there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco trafficker who's now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. Explain to people here why this is actually a breach of international law.
Well, it's interesting because what you read out has so many inaccuracies that it's mind-numbing. I mean, let's just take the simple inaccuracies, dismiss them, and get to underneath it. You know, this idea that there's been an indictment sitting in the U.S. Justice Department for a very long time is not true. I've read the indictment; it's 20 odd pages long, and it's dated. And it's not dated from years ago. It's dated from just before the military action against Venezuela. The indictment says a number of interesting things. One of them is it charges President Nicolas Maduro Moro's First Ladies Cilia, Flores, and four other people with being leaders of a cartel called the Cartel de los Sols, or the Cartel of the Suns. Well, I wrote about this so-called cartel last year. In fact, in 2024, so now almost a year and a half ago. So I investigated this. What is the Cartel de los Sols? I asked a lot of people. Firstly, as part of this, because I take this stuff seriously, I read the last 10 years, the annual reports of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency. No mention of the Cartel de los Sols in their reports. No mention of Nicolas Maduro Moros, no mention of any of the six people indicted. And then I asked in Venezuela, well, who are these Cartel of the Sols? I talked to some journalists. They said, well, it's interesting. The Cartel de los Sols don't exist. It was a media fabrication, and I don't mean fabrication in a negative way. Some journalists in the 1990s, before Nicolas Maduro entered politics, before Hugo Chavez won the first presidential election in 1998, some journalists noticed that there had been a number of military officers under the previous dispensation who were accused of being involved in drug running. On their lapels, they had a sun emblem, like the militaries have a lapel for their brigade and so on. So the journalists called them the Cartel de los Sols as a way that journalists sometimes do. It's a way to say that this is part of this military, but there's no Cartel de los Sols as such. So it was a fabrication by the journalists to make a point about these particular military officers. This is now 30 years ago. And so, at the time in the media, this phrase was utilized. There's no cartel. It doesn't exist. And then to have accused Mr. Maduro of being the leader of a fabricated cartel, this is by the United States intelligence services, is remarkable. Secondly, they accused him of being the leader of another gang called Tren de Aragua. Now, this is a real gang. It was created in the prisons that is to say, prisons in Venezuela. So these are people put into prison by Mr. Maduro's government who created a gang in prison. They subsequently mostly left the country when they were released and so on, and they are outside Venezuela. Mr. Maduro there's no evidence that he's involved with this gang, which is actually a problem in places like the United States and so on. So the basis of the indictment is itself false. Now, the idea that you have a police action, I mean, this befuddles the mind, because the United Nations Charter, the Organization of American States Charter, they have procedures. The first thing you have to do when you have an indictment against a foreign national is call for their extradition. You go to Interpol or the International Police. You ask for a red warrant, a warrant of arrest. If it's the head of state of another country, there's something called a head of state immunity. You have to approach the International Criminal Court and so on. There's a procedure. The United States government did not follow any of this. It just went in, snatched, kidnapped Mr. Maduro, took him out of the... I don't see how the US government can make this claim in any way but in bad faith. I mean, either they are lying in bad faith, or they are stupid. And I don't think they're stupid. They're very intelligent people, and they are basically pulling a fast one by saying, oh, wait a minute, this is not a military action. It's not a military action. You had 150 military aircraft. There was no FBI aircraft. There was no Federal Bureau of Investigations officers. You had the Delta Force. It's the United States government that said the Delta Force entered Venezuelan soil. That is a military intervention.
Like many Indians, I'm not familiar with Venezuela and its geopolitics and its history. And yet, there are reports today that suggest that President Maduro was a dictatorial leader. There were elections in 2024 that he did not accept and which went in the favor of the opposition, it seems, and that many common Venezuelans are perhaps happy that he's out of the picture. So even if America has breached international law, and that's unacceptable, and we'll come to why it has done that, what is the mood on the ground in Venezuela? What are people there making of what has just happened to them?
Well, firstly, I've been to Venezuela, I don't know, about, you know, 35, 40 times. I've spent a lot of time there. I first covered Venezuela on behalf of Frontline magazine in the 1990s. When NRAM sent me off to Colombia, Mexico, all over the place. It was an extraordinary experience to be in Peru, covering guerrilla movements, and so on. Anyway, the thing is that
you met President Maduro, haven't you?
I met Hugo Chavez before him. I met Maduro many times. In fact, in the building from which he was kidnapped, I know him very well. And so on. But the fact of the matter is that when the Venezuelan transformation started in 1998-99, a lot of very poor people for the first time saw the government doing something for them, trying to abolish poverty, trying to make sure hunger was no more on the agenda and so on. And at the same time, a lot of rich people saw their lives being squeezed. So, this is not a situation where 100% of Venezuela went one way or the other. This is a class struggle. It's a very serious political process taking place in Venezuela. The rich very much hate Chavez, and they hate Maduro. And Maria Corina Machado and people like her come from that part of Venezuelan society, very wealthy backgrounds, people who want their place back in society, which they feel has been taken away from them. I understand their problem, but it's not my problem, and it's not the problem of the majority of the people of Venezuela. It's interesting that when Maduro himself, after Hugo Chavez died in 2013, when Maduro ran for his first election as president in 2014, he won merely by 51 to 49%. It was extremely tight. He won against Henry Capriles, who is now the leader of the opposition in the National Assembly in Venezuela and is very much opposed to Maria Corina Machado. He thinks that her antics are very dangerous. What the opposition, who I've interviewed over the years, will tell you quite directly is that that's about where the Venezuelan electorate is, different from the public, because most poor people don't end up voting. But the electorate is somewhere around that. That it's very difficult for the right to get over 50% of the vote, because they have to come in and argue against the Chavez reforms. They have to say, we want to welcome back, foreign oil companies. We want to give them more of the profit. We want to privatize everything. We want the old oligarchy to return. And, got to understand that the rates of inequality in some of these Latin American societies are grotesque. And so it's very hard for the right to come back and say that to the people. What they can say is that, crime is too bad, and the government is associated with crime. I'll come back to that if that's interesting to you. But the main thing here is that in the last election of 2024, which the opposition contested, and by the way, the opposition has contested every single election since 1999. They have never been satisfied with any election result, even though it was without a doubt that Hugo Chavez could have walked all over these people, easily. In the last election, it was something like, I'm now remembering, 44% for Edmundo Gonzalez, who was the proxy for Marina Corina Machado, and 54% for Nicolas Maduro. If you're going to rig an election, you have to rig an election like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, 98% winning, 2% to the opposition. You sprinkle. Paul Kagame of Rwanda, enormous US ally, 99% of the vote for Paul Kagame, 1% for the opposition. I mean, if you're going to rig an election, would you rig an election 51% to 49%, 54% to 44%? Opposition political figures in Venezuela who don't go abroad and take refuge with the CIA and say, let's undermine, please come and invade my country. Those opposition people in the country who are trying to build an opposition to the government, they will tell you, we have a hard time because the Chavista bloc, that is the bloc that supports these reforms of the Maduro government and the Chavez, these reforms are extremely popular. Look, any government that is stuck with the kind of sanctions the US places on Venezuela is going to have a tough time. And the US government very cleverly sanctions the state and public enterprises, forces the state to privatize, and frankly, forces the energy bloc, which is the major the bloc that is able to bring in foreign revenue, forces them to use quote unquote Hawala networks, non-official networks of currency. So of course there's going to be evidence of corruption. You have created the conditions for corruption.
So, Vijay, you're saying that President Maduro was popular and that he was not running a repressive regime, even as you explain the context in which he was operating? Because
Well,
is
yes, yeah.
is your ideological support and acceptance of what he represents and what his government represents, is that, would that make you blind to the fact that his government was repressive as well? Because that is what many reports suggest. Or is this a war of narratives?
No, it's not a war of narratives. In fact, it's a class struggle, because it depends who you're talking to. I won't say it's not repressive. Take the case of India today. Yeah. What is Umar Khalid doing in prison? He's an under trial. I don't even know why he's in prison. What was the cause for the crackdown on NewsClick? A media operation. Yeah. Completely bizarre allegations against Probir Purkaista. You have farmers protesting and the government saying that they are anti-national. I mean, is that a repressive government? It's a class struggle. It's a struggle between a section that wants to privatize agricultural, markets, and a section that says, no, we need to survive as farmers. It's a serious struggle on the streets. It's a struggle over issues. See, what has happened is that liberalism has collapsed these conversations into things like repressive, non-repressive, corrupt, non-corrupt, and so on. It's not willing to look at the issues at play. Is it merely a question of repression? I mean, in El Salvador, a government beloved by Donald Trump, the government basically sends paratroopers into poor neighborhoods and shoots people that they accuse of being drug dealers. In Brazil, 122 people were shot to death in one operation in a poor neighborhood. I mean, imagine there are prison cells in El Salvador where there are people tossed in. There is no due process for them. In fact, the United States is exporting prisoners to El Salvador, a little bit like the kind of Rwanda policy that the British government keeps fantasizing about. US is already doing it with El Salvador. So this framework of repressive, non-repressive, it's not useful. The fact is that it is true that in Venezuela, a section of the public feels repressed. That's the rich. They are not able to live the way they used to live. They cannot treat their workers the way they used to be able to treat their workers. They can't, fire people at will and so on. They are repressed. Their absolute power to drive their cars over the poor on the street is no longer allowed. I mean, in India, we have ministers' children literally drive drunk, drive over poor people sleeping on the street, and nobody's charged. But meanwhile, a young boy doing his PhD at JNU is sitting for 5 years in a prison cell. Well, yes, Umar Khalid is repressed, and that the child of a minister is not repressed. Well, if you now arrest that child of a minister for killing somebody on the street, his father is going to go to the Western media and say, oh my God, my son is, we are facing repression in India. There's a government that is coming after us. We are, after all, just trying to make a living and so on. And meanwhile, these scoundrels like Umar Khalid are running free. I mean, somebody is repressed in a society. Okay, I'm sorry to provoke the liberal barriers. Somebody is repressed, and it just depends on from what perspective. It was true that for generations in Latin America, the rich repressed the vast majority of the population that was the poor. They repressed them through hunger, through starvation. They repressed them through using the police against them. And now in countries like Venezuela, the rich find they can't do that. And they actually experience their lack of being able to drive over the poor as a form of repression, so that then they go to the White House, to Donald Trump's office, and Maria Corina Machado says, please take my Nobel Prize, please come and bomb my country. I mean, imagine that. Imagine that. Imagine that.
So what is the mood in Venezuela?
Well, the mood is complicated. Firstly, immediately after the 3rd of January, there was an enormous sense of shock. No country in South America has been bombed by the United States. Panama has been bombed, but it's technically in Mesoamerica, no large country. The United States has conducted coups in Brazil, the largest country. It's conducted coups in Uruguay, in Argentina, in Paraguay, in Chile, in Bolivia, just everywhere. Yeah. But it has never militarily attacked a country before. So this was an enormous shock. The second thing is the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro Moros was completely unexpected. Yeah, I mean, this was a real blow to people, because he is an extremely charismatic person and was beloved by an enormous section of the poor. He was a bus driver. He comes from the working people. He's not from among the oligarchy. So there's a lot of sympathy for him. At the same time, after the first few days where there was really no activity on the streets at all, there have been big demonstrations against the attack on Venezuela. Because the thing to understand is, and this is what Trump now does understand, is that Venezuela, as a consequence of the Chavez period, is an extremely patriotic society. I mean, it's a lot like Iran. I mean, the United States understands every time there's a US attack on Iran, Iranians are very patriotic. They come onto the street and say, no attack on Iran. Whatever their feelings about the government. I mean, I'll tell you something. I don't carry a lot of water for the government in India. Mr. Modi doesn't like me at all. We have a long history together. But if there's an attack like this on the Indian government, I would be the first on the streets to say that the United States or any government should get out of India, because it's a matter of sovereignty. I mean, this should concern everybody around the world. The president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, a critic of Nicolas Maduro, on the morning of the 3rd of January, within hours, made at a press conference, he said that, this is outrageous. Today, Venezuela, tomorrow, anybody. And I'm telling you directly, as a critic of the RSS and the BJP, I would like to write it now and save it, saying that release Narendra Modi. It's ridiculous, because this is a matter of the Indian Constitution. It's a matter of international law, and above all, it's a matter of your sense of patriotism.
Yeah, yeah. So, Vijay, what are the underlying reasons for President Trump's actions? Is in Venezuela? Is it just about the oil? Is it more than that? Because you've been studying it and you've written about this actually in the latest newsletter that Tricontinental put out, right? And you talk about something called hyper-imperialism. You want to explain that to us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you asked this question because it's so interesting how Trump, in a way that makes him slightly different from his predecessors in the U.S. Presidency, is sometimes just so blunt about things. It's interesting. Yeah.
And so blatant, right? It's almost like you just mentioned coups that America has instigated across, Southern America, South America, and here you have, a president who's taken military action. It's out there in the open. He writes about it. He says he's the ruler now of Venezuela. So all these statements. Now the letter about Greenland that he's written to the Norwegian Prime Minister, these words take a lot of our attention, right? But underlying that is something that America has actually been doing from time immemorial. Is that fair to say? And is that something is that the case you make?
Well, yes. I mean, there are different timelines, and different parts of the world have experienced this differently. But the Western Hemisphere has experienced this from the birth of the United States as a project. I mean, people misunderstand the American Revolution of 1776. It wasn't necessarily a revolution for freedom, as it were. It was also a revolution against the British Crown, saying that you cannot go beyond the 13 colonies. I mean, the British Crown had said you can't cross the Mississippi River. And the colonials, the settlers in the 13 colonies, wanted to go off all the way out, I suppose, to what was then going to be Mexico. And that was part of the reason for the revolution, is they wanted to conquer all the land. And they said so at the time. They felt held back by the British Crown. It wasn't just that George III was crazy, which he may very well have been. We don't have his medical records, but he may have been nuts. Doesn't matter. The point is they articulated a view. Well, very soon after the revolution, James Monroe, Secretary of State, then U.S. President, in 1823, that's not a generation after the revolution, articulates the Monroe Doctrine, where what James Monroe argues, very, very well written doctrine actually, what Monroe argues is that the entire Western Hemisphere is to be under the tutelage of the United States government. I don't know if you know this or people know this, but the first country to recognize the existence of the United States wasn't France or anywhere, it was Morocco. Morocco, the Kingdom of Morocco, the Sultan of Morocco was the first to recognize the United States. And the reason the Sultan of Morocco did that maneuver is because he wanted an ally against the British and French corsairs that were dogging the coastline of Morocco, and the United States, has this fealty with the Moroccan Sultan. But the idea that the United States has, or Monroe has, is that look, the British and French have to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, indeed stay out of North Africa, because United States goes in the first war the US fights is in North Africa, but says that this part of the world is not yours anymore. This is ours. And then secondly, if it's not yours, we are going to manage it and take charge of it. And from 1823 onwards, the United States has basically claimed this whole area as its dominion. And regardless of how the relations between, say, India and the US have gone, or other places. The Western Hemisphere is. So Donald Trump in late 2025 released the national security strategy of the United States. And the interesting thing is that every single national security strategy that's come before this one has re-articulated the Monroe Doctrine, but hasn't necessarily named it. But it's re-articulated it. No US president has said that the Western Hemisphere is not of the US, and no US president has said that we recognize the sovereignty of Canada, of Mexico. I mean, the United States stole 1/3 of Mexico after the war that they fought, Battle of the Alamo and so on. Anyway, in this particular national security strategy, Donald Trump directly references the Monroe Doctrine and talks about the Trump corollary. Some people are saying Donroe Doctrine, whatever. The Trump corollary is basically, we will use the complete might of the United States to secure our right to the Western Hemisphere. And the first action was Venezuela. Shortly thereafter, it was Greenland. The United States is not going to stop. I mean, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, hastened to China to meet with President Xi Jinping. You got to understand that in less than a decade ago, the Canadian government arrested the daughter of the owner of Huawei, major tech company in China, Meng Jie. They arrested her. She was the chief financial officer. The Canadian government arrested her at the behest of the United States government. And now Mark Carney goes to Beijing, sits across from Xi Jinping and says, this relationship is the most important one, and we need a trade agreement, and they sign a deal. This is Canada. Okay, so Canada, Greenland, this is north of the United States in the Western. They understand what is happening to Venezuela is not about drugs. It's not about popularity. It's not about crime. It's about the US establishing dominion from the Arctic Circle down to the Antarctic. And everybody knows that. That's why Gabriel Boric in Chile said, today, Venezuela, tomorrow, anybody. He's talking about Chile, he's talking about Argentina, he's talking about all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Why this hyper imperialism? Because I was reading what you've written and you've linked it to the rise of the global south.
Yes, I mean, in fact, more specifically, it has to do with China. So if you take the West,
position as you position China as the leader of the global south?
it's not the leader of the global south, because the Chinese are actually quite interesting about this. They believe in multilateralism. They are not interested in a bloc theory of the world. It's what Jaishankar called the NATO mentality. They don't subscribe, like India doesn't subscribe to the NATO mentality. We don't want an Asian bloc, to contest Europe or to contest. We want a multilateral system under the dominion of the UN Charter, not one major power or the other, but the UN Charter. So China has had an incredible economic explosion over the last 20 years. No surprise to anybody. I mean, it's just outstanding. The growth rate, the fact that they've been able to abolish poverty, the high-tech goods and services that they export. In all of Latin American countries, in fact, right from Canada down to Chile, in most countries, either China is the leading trade partner or it's the number 2 trade partner after the United States. It's either leading or it's number 2. In most countries, like Chile, like Argentina, it's the number 1 trading partner. And the United States knows that it cannot supplant China. Why? In Chile, for instance, China buys iron ore, copper, cherries, and so on at scale. The US does not have industrial manufacturing to buy iron ore, lithium, copper. It just doesn't have the capacity. China buys the bulk of Brazil's exported soy. There is no way the United States can buy all that soy. So the United States can force Chile to stop selling to China, but it cannot supplant, it cannot find new markets for the Chileans. So it can impoverish Chile, but it cannot, give it an alternative. Similarly with Canada, it can beggar its neighbor, but it can't provide an alternative to China. So that the existence of the Chinese economic, juggernaut, really, the existence of that is something that the United States sees as very threatening. The only mechanism it has at its disposal to get rid of China are twofold. One is its military power to threaten to take Greenland, or to threaten the Canadians that we're just going to walk in and make you part of to threaten people with military action. And the second is with information warfare, where they will come in and say, the Chinese want to spy on you, the Chinese want to do this, the Chinese want to do that. Now, it's interesting. Whether the Chinese want to spy on one country or the other is actually moot. It's a little bit like the debate in Europe. A story broke that the US government had hacked into Angela Merkel, at the time Chancellor of Germany. The US government had hacked into her phone. But the debate in Germany was, don't use Chinese tech tools because China might spy on you in the future. I mean, it's bizarre how our minds are crafted by the information out there. Facts are irrelevant. It's impressions. It's also a little bit of racism. This idea that the Chinese are a horde, the old Mongol horde coming to overcome you and so on. I mean, some of this is dumb. It's like when India said, okay, we're going to ban Chinese apps. What's dumb about that is that the Chinese didn't know how to retaliate because there were no Indian apps to ban. I mean, why don't you make Indian apps? Well, why are we reliant on Chinese apps? These ideas are dumb. Let's ban these apps. You're just hurting your own consumers. They have less choices of things to do. I use some Chinese technology, some US technology, some South Korean technology. I'd like to put together, what I think is the most valuable and useful for me. I should have the choice to do that. Why should the US government tell me that no, Chinese technology is banned in Chile, you can't use it? I mean, what? Why? How does that even make sense? Yeah. So this hyper-imperialism is the use of largely military violence, but also to some extent information, by trying to ban news sites, shutting them down, going after them. I mean, it's ludicrous. What are you afraid of? It's a little bit like in India. What was the government afraid of with NewsClick? Have a debate. Mr. Adani was in the process of taking over NDTV. I mean, NDTV has like 1 billion times more viewers than NewsClick. Why is this little asterisks and obliques like village scaring you so much? I have a book coming out, soon in Delhi called Ye Hindustan Hamara Hai, which is my story about my family, and I tell a story of Arun Jaitley. In 1993, when I met him at an event. My granduncle was a big BJP. He was like the intellectual hero of Arun Jaitley. So at his birthday party, Arun Jaitley corners me and takes me to a corner and says, Vijay, we read you at the office and we don't like what you say, but you can write whatever you want. But he said, if you make fun of us, be careful. I mean, the shallow,
Yeah.
the shallow eggshell of what are you so worried about? I mean, I was writing at the time in the Pioneer, which is a right-wing newspaper. Yeah, and I was covering the Selampur riots. Like, calm down, Arun. Like, why are you so upset? What is bothering you? And it's similarly, it's a fragile eggshell ego that these people seem to have. Donald Trump, why didn't I get the Nobel Prize? I mean, such fragility of ego. The masculinity is so fragile. To me, it's extraordinary. The fragility. Okay, I get it. You're Mr. Tough guy and whatever, you want to be Mr. Tough, but man, masculinity is so bizarre. It's like I'm the toughest guy in the world, and then I'm so fragile. Oh my God, such a cliche.
So to counter China, this hyper imperialism that the US is employing and this sort of dominion that it wants to establish where the Western Hemisphere is concerned, one of the key things is to counter China's economic prowess. That's the point. The underlying point. So, Vijay, what happens to the global south in this context now? And I find it interesting in this latest piece that you've written. You don't mention India in the global south at all, and we have also noticed over the past, key milestones. Whether it was what has happened in Gaza in the past 3 years since October 7, 2023, whether it is what is happening in Venezuela, whether it was whether there were the attacks on Iran last year in 2025. The Indian government's reaction to all of this has been very, very generic, very muted, some would say very weak. And we also are in a situation where, India has prided itself for a very long time as being, if not one of the leaders of the global south, at least one of its clearest voices. So where is the global south, and then where is India in this
It's
context?
very, you firstly you've asked this question very well. So I mean, the answer is in your question, and that's the problem with well asked questions, is that they answer themselves. But to go a little bit deeper into the second part of your question, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the international system that we have, the UN Charter, the UN bodies, and so on. India has played a key role. I mean, people don't recognize that Indian peacekeepers were in Gaza in the 1950s. I broke a story years ago where I'd gone to the archive in Beirut, and when I was living there, and I read about Nehru's visit to Gaza, and I didn't realize that the Israelis had tried to bring his plane down when he took off from. I interviewed Inder Rikie and so on. I recently wrote about it again in Outlook because it's such an interesting story. India plays a very major role. Inder Rikie was such an important person as a military man in the creation of the international peacekeeping, the Blue Helmets, and the fundamental role in refugees and all of this. Such a disappointment that in recent years, I mean, the fact that while a genocide is going on, which let's use the International Court of Justice terminology, plausible evidence of genocide is happening. Mr. Modi on Twitter is exchanging birthday greetings with Benjamin Netanyahu, who has at the time an International Criminal Court warrant for his arrest on the grounds of conducting a genocide. There's something vulgar about saying my great friend Benjamin, happy birthday to you. I mean, there's something vulgar about that, I'm afraid. There's no need for that. Like, India doesn't need to have a prime minister that exchanges birthday greetings on Twitter with somebody who has an ICC warrant. That seems peculiar for the largest country in the world, an important country in the global south. It puts India in divergence from the rest of the mood of the south.
So
On the yeah.
So has that been about India trying to get, into the special relationship with the US, besides, of course, the special relationship with Israel? What is going on? Because, we saw the reaction to Iran, the attack, the Israel and US attacks on Iran, and India's reaction. We are now seeing India's reaction to Venezuela. Is it all because of the tariffs that were slapped on us and the and how we don't have a trade deal? What is going on? What is your take on what's going on?
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get an easy answer, because remember last year, when the United States, Trump in particular, put pressure on the Indian government, saying you got to condemn Russia. Yeah, you have to stop buying oil from Russia, and Mr. Modi refused, and then went to Tianjin, and met with Putin and met with that was interesting. Of course, there's a practicality involved there. India is a very poor country. It's embarrassingly high rates of poverty, and if India stops buying oil from Russia, you're going to have greater food inflation, fuel inflation, and you're going to have more suffering of the people, and no government in India can afford that. So in that sense, it's not politics that were in the lead, but economics. But that didn't mean that Mr. Modi needed to have gone to Tianjin. He could have refused to stop buying oil and not gone to Tianjin and not, hung out with Putin and so on, but he did. So that's why I'm saying you're not going to get a straight, easy answer, because he's doing that on the one side, and then he's wishing, but that's not non-alignment. That's a misunderstanding of non-alignment. Non-alignment, it doesn't mean you don't take a position in the world. Non-alignment means you stand by the UN Charter, and you stand by the logic of the principles of of Panchila or Dasashila or whatever, whichever version of it you want to take. But at least the Panchil principles from Bandung, that's non-alignment. Non-alignment doesn't mean you sit between two
Yeah.
extremes. That's a wrong interpretation. So it's very hard to answer your question. When Indian government says, well, we worry about Indian nationals in Venezuela. I mean, for God's sake, it's a violation of the UN Charter. At the very least, you should raise that as an issue. It's a question of your own role in the UN system. At the very least, the attack on Iran, at the very least, say that that's a violation of the UN Charter. At the very least, I mean, part of it is I fear that this government wants to keep the door open for so-called hot pursuit attacks on Pakistan or something. I don't know what is happening here. But I would suggest that this is a bad look for the Indian government. I'm just talking about optics here. It's a bad look.
Since you spend so much time covering the global south and tracking what is happening there, how do these countries see India today?
Everywhere I go, people ask me what is happening in India. What is going on with India? Like there's a couple of things that seem irrational. One of them is that people ask on a regular basis, why is India not able to settle its problems with China? What is the problem here? I mean, you have square kilometers, maybe even 100 square kilometers of dispute in Arunachal Pradesh, some other disputes here and there. You have the potential of vast trade. You have the potential of becoming an economic dynamo of Asia, India and China together. And it's minor border disputes that are holding things back. And I always say, look, it's much more than the border dispute. It's about the history, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't make sense to people, frankly. All around the world, people are trying to take advantage of this moment of Chinese economic buoyancy. And India is sitting this out. Imagining that somehow our services economy is going to make India the next China. If you're not going to increase your industrial manufacturing, it's not going to happen. India imports everything, imports intermediate goods, imports capital goods. We don't make computers, for God's sake. India, by the way, before liberalization, was had one of the best public sector companies that was making computers. We just shut that down, and now we don't make computers. You can't have buoyancy unless you're making high-tech goods and services.
So, what's the other question that countries in the global south are asking you about India? One is, why don't we just figure out and make a relationship with China work? What's the other one?
Well, the other one in the last 3 years has been about Israel. I mean, it is perplexing. And I mean, I was in Beirut recently at a meeting of intellectuals from across the Arab world. And this is, they always ask, is it because of the anti-Muslim, things we hear in India? Is this the issue? And I always try to explain that this is not the issue with Israel cannot be reduced to that. It's a little more disturbing, in my opinion. It has to do with arms sales. It has to do with all kinds of ideas about India's belief that Israel is a major startup nation, which I don't think is true. That in fact there'll be more interesting tech in East Asia than in Israel, and I don't know why India wants to make that to hitch its wagon to tiny little Israel. But people ask that kind of question: is why isn't India more forthright about the violence in Gaza? I mean, when Yasser Arafat arrived in Delhi in 1983, Indira Gandhi went to greet him at the airport, and he said, "My sister has come for me."
Yeah.
We don't have that anymore.
Some of us who grew up at that time, we've seen those images, right? And now we don't see anything like that. In fact, we see very different images. Which I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I've committed to letting you go in an hour. So tell me, what happens next? Does the European Union fold on Greenland? Does America just annexes Greenland? Do you have any forecasting that you can do there based on your reportage, based on your analysis of all of the years gone by?
Well, firstly, the European Union doesn't exist. I mean, there is no union, and I'm not even sure about Europe. I think it's an extraordinarily fraught project. I mean, we should have learned our lesson from Brexit and the popularity of Brexit on the European continent among the far right parties. We should have learned our lesson from that. That these people who strut about on a stage. I mean, Trump he's clocked them. He has their number. He knows how limited they are. He's making fun of them. He just tweeted a photograph of them sitting in his office, and he has a map with a big giant US flag on Greenland. I mean, he doesn't care. He knows they are useless. What can they do? They are desperate. They are terrified. They're saying things like, Keir Starmer is so pathetic, saying things like allies shouldn't use tariffs against each other. What are you talking about, Sir Keir? I mean, you've hitched your wagon to the wrong guy, man. It's not going to work for you. You're saying things like, this is the integrity. Until the Greenland thing, they believed that the United States would abandon them on Ukraine, not visualizing that. Forget abandoning them on Ukraine. The US was just going to say Greenland is ours, and the ridiculousness of it all. The ridiculousness is Greenland is already substantially under the command of the United States. There's a large military base there. It's only got 57,000 people. Do you know that Greenland is 50 times the size of Denmark? 50 times. What gives a European country the right to have a colony 50 times its size? Yeah, I am not taking the position of defend Europe against Trump. I would say let the Greenlanders decide. And the United States, why should I cry tears for the Danish when they are okay with the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president just a few weeks ago?
We now have this proposal for a board of peace, which we heard of for the first time last year when President Trump was in Israel. India has been invited to join it, like a whole bunch of other countries, and a lot of people see that this as being something that replaces the UN or provides an alternative. What is your take on the board of peace, and what should India do with that invitation? And of course, it seems we have to put down $1 billion to be part of it.
Well, yeah, that's the Anuradha. The thing about Trump is there's always money. I mean,
It's all
he's a
about
poker.
the money always.
Yeah. He plays poker, and you have to come into his room and put the money on the table before you can sit down. I mean, this guy is a serious gambler. He knows. And who gets the billion? The Palestinians? I don't think so. We don't even know. There's no accountability. I mean, you're asking a tough question. I think a lot of countries will end up joining this board of peace out of the mistaken belief that if they don't join it, it'll get worse. That they will provide some sort of voice of sanity and so on. I mean, I just if I was in a position to have any influence on this, I would say major countries should get together and together say they are not going to participate, and that they should not allow the United Nations to take a role, and they should offer an alternative. But nobody is doing that. And that's a sign also of the weakness of the global South. It's a sign of the weakness of other forces. The United States right now is the most powerful military actor in the world, and it has shown countries they will use their military force to intimidate people into following their diktat. And Trump has been much more forthright in this. But I would say that this is not an enormous departure. We got to remember that it was Barack Obama who signed the executive order that opens the door on Venezuela to be treated in this way. He provided the legal framework for Trump to do this. And I just feel like the rest of the world either has to wake up to these realities or has to go through a very terrible period before we come out on the other side. And I'm afraid, Anuradha, that in fact it's the second, is that the world is not going to wake up to these realities. We're going to go through a very terrible bunch of years until at some point further, when more fires burn across the world, the contradictions will produce an alternative.
Vijay, those are gloomy words, but I guess they are, that's the reality as you see it. Thank you so much. We'll keep talking. I hope we can do another conversation about India's left next time.
I would love to. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.